The cranberry sauce was still bubbling on the stove when Taylor's phone buzzed for the 6th time that morning. I stood by the sink rinsing sweet potatoes, watching him from the corner of my eye as his face lit up with a smile he hadn't reserved for me in years. "Could you check the rolls in the oven?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though the silence that followed said everything. "In a minute," he muttered, already hunched over his screen, thumbs moving fast. The rolls would probably burn, like they did last year, but I didn't press. Before I continue narrating the story of Jordan Davidson, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Today was about family, or at least I told myself that to get through. I'd woken up at 5, determined to make Thanksgiving perfect for the kids. Hunter was flying in from D.C., his law firm finally giving him a break long enough to visit. Faith was driving down from college, her hatchback stuffed with textbooks and dirty laundry. My table was already set with Grandma's china and the lace runner I'd ironed at midnight while Taylor worked late. The smell of sage, butter, and cinnamon filled the kitchen, but it couldn't mask the tension that had been building for months. Taylor barely looked at me anymore, and when he did, it was with the practiced blankness of someone hiding a double life. The signs had been there. Late-night meetings, mysterious charges on our joint card, lipstick smudges that weren't mine. I kept telling myself not to jump to conclusions, not to become that paranoid wife digging through text messages and scenting his shirts. But sometimes the truth doesn't knock. It kicks down the door. Faith arrived first, bursting in with her usual chaotic energy, a bottle of Pinot in one hand and her phone in the other. "Mom, this smells amazing! Did you seriously hand-stuff the turkey again?" she asked, already unzipping her coat. "Of course," I smiled, wiping my hands on my apron. "Some traditions are worth the hassle." Behind her, the wind whipped fallen leaves into the foyer as she dragged in her bag. Hunter showed up an hour later, briefcase in hand, always the professional, even in his downtime. "You look tired," I said, smoothing his lapel like he was still 10 years old. "Big case," he replied, forcing a smile, but his eyes were scanning the room like he was bracing for something. Maybe he felt it too, that undercurrent of something not quite right. "Where's Dad?" he asked, and I pointed silently toward the den, where Taylor had been glued to his phone for the past hour. Dinner was ready by 5, the table a magazine spread of harvest colors and effort no one would truly appreciate. Taylor finally emerged wearing a blazer he hadn't worn in years and that smug little smile I used to think was charming. "You look nice," I said because the silence would have been worse. "So do you," he replied, barely glancing at my dress, the one he used to say made my eyes glow. Faith and Hunter took their seats, plates clinking as I carved the turkey with steady hands. The first 15 minutes went beautifully, almost suspiciously so. Hunter complimented the stuffing. Faith teased me about my obsession with centerpiece symmetry, and even Taylor chuckled at a joke. I let myself believe, for a moment, that the cracks had healed, that maybe we'd make it through this dinner without drama. Then Taylor's phone buzzed again, and this time he didn't silence it. He looked at the screen, cleared his throat, and stood. "There's something I need to tell you all," he began, straightening his blazer like he was preparing to present at a board meeting. Hunter and Faith paused, forks midair, and looked up. "Taylor," I said softly, instinctively, sensing the storm before it hit. "Can it wait until dessert?" He didn't even glance at me. "I'm selling the house," he said bluntly, dropping the words like grenades on the table. Silence fell, thick and immediate. Faith blinked, confused, and Hunter's mouth fell open. "Wait, what?" Faith asked, looking from me to her father. But Taylor had already shifted into his next line like he'd practiced it in front of the mirror. "My girlfriend Holly and her kids need more space," he said, as though announcing a new tax bracket or a weather forecast. "Her apartment is too small. Jack's 8, Joel's 6, and Elise just turned 4. He rattled off their names like they belonged in this house. I stared at him, numb, as the candles flickered in the silence. Faith's face crumpled before she could speak. "You have a girlfriend," she whispered, the words barely audible. Hunter shoved his chair back, jaw clenched, fists on the table. "This is how you tell us?" he snapped, voice shaking. Taylor raised his hands like a hostage negotiator. "I didn't want to lie anymore." "Oh, so now's the time for truth?" I asked, finally finding my voice, quiet, but razor-sharp. He turned to me, surprised I'd spoken. Jordan. No, I interrupted, standing slowly and walking to my purse on the sideboard. I pulled out the envelope I'd carried for weeks, waiting for this exact moment. Since we're making announcements, I said, placing it next to his plate. Taylor looked down at the envelope like it was radioactive. Hunter's eyes darted between us, confused. Faith was already wiping tears with her sleeve, shaking her head as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. Taylor reached for the envelope, hesitating just before his fingers touched it. "What is this?" he asked. "Open it," I said simply, sitting back down and reaching for the sweet potatoes. My hands were steady now, the panic having burned itself out days ago. Taylor opened the flap slowly, pulling out the papers inside. His face paled as he read the contents. One page, then another, then another. His mouth opened, but no words came. Faith leaned forward. "Dad?" she asked, voice trembling. "What is it?" Taylor looked at me, betrayal and disbelief etched into every line of his face. You transferred the deed?" he finally croaked. 3 months ago. I replied calmly. Funny what you can accomplish while someone else is playing house with another woman's kids. He was shaking now, the confident posture collapsing into something small and panicked. "You had no right," he hissed, clutching the papers like they were the last thing tethering him to this house. "Actually," I said, leaning back in my chair, "I had every right. You just didn't know it because you stopped paying attention to anything that didn't come with a push-up bra and custody schedule." Hunter let out a low whistle, eyebrows raised. Taylor looked at our children as if searching for backup, but their faces told him everything he needed to know. Faith looked betrayed. Hunter looked disgusted. I just looked tired of the lies, the gaslighting, the pretending. "Enjoy your new life," I said, taking another bite of casserole. "You'll need it, because this one," I waved vaguely at the table, "you've officially lost." Taylor's fingers clenched around the deed transfer documents like they could somehow reverse what was written in black ink. His voice shook as he said, "You planned this behind my back?" I didn't flinch, just kept my eyes on my plate, calmly slicing through turkey like this was any ordinary holiday dinner. "I protected myself," I said evenly, my voice as smooth as the cranberry glaze on his untouched ham. "You made your decisions, Taylor. Now you get to live with the consequences." Hunter leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes locked on his father. "You've been lying to us for months," he said, his voice low but firm. "Don't look surprised that Mom stopped waiting around for you to come clean." Taylor started to speak, but Hunter cut him off with a shake of his head. "No, seriously. How did you think this was going to go?" Faith was crying now, silent tears slipping down her cheeks as she stared at the crumpled napkin in her lap. "You introduced us to her kids by name," she whispered, her voice small and broken, "before you even apologized for what you did to Mom." Taylor opened his mouth, but nothing came out, just a stunned, dry silence. "I thought you were better than this," she said, standing shakily. "But I guess you're just another man who traded his family in for a fresh start." Taylor looked around the table like a man drowning with no shoreline in sight. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said, still gripping the documents, his knuckles white. "We're still a family, and "No," I said firmly now. "You made a choice, and now you get to live on the other side of that choice, with all that comes with it." Faith walked out first, brushing past her father without looking at him, leaving her plate half full and untouched. Hunter stood next, his jaw tight as he said, "Don't call me until you figure out how to tell the truth without a script." Taylor tried to speak, but Hunter just shook his head and followed his sister. I sat at the table in the silence that followed, the ticking of the kitchen clock suddenly loud. Taylor slowly lowered himself into the seat he had stood from like a man 10 years older. "You blindsided me," he muttered, the bravado fully gone now. "You used to tell me everything." I looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the man I married, but a shadow of him. "I used to think we told each other everything," I said softly. "But then you started confiding in Holly instead." He dropped his gaze. guilt finally cracking through the mask he'd worn all evening. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he mumbled, folding the papers like they might somehow become less real. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You didn't mean for me to find out, you mean?" His silence was louder than any confession he could have made. I stood then, beginning to gather the plates, the silver clinking softly against the porcelain. "I'm going to box up some leftovers for Hunter and Faith," I said, not looking at him. "You should go." He didn't argue, just slowly got to his feet. I watched as he walked toward the front door, still clutching the envelope, still hoping this was just a nightmare he'd wake up from. At the doorway, he paused, turning slightly. "Jordan," he started, his voice tentative, broken. "Don't," I said, sharp and immediate. "Just go." When the door closed behind him, the silence that settled over the house was deep and strangely peaceful. I packed the leftovers with deliberate care, labeling each container with Hunter's or Faith's name in neat, Sharpie letters. The kitchen was still warm, still glowing from the soft amber light overhead, but it no longer felt heavy. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I had to perform. I didn't feel like I was waiting for something bad to happen. Upstairs, I changed into flannel pajamas and tied my hair back with a band I found in the nightstand drawer. I brushed my teeth, washed my face, and climbed into bed with a novel I hadn't touched since July. The house creaked in familiar ways as it cooled, the wood settling like an exhale after holding its breath too long. Taylor wasn't pacing in the hallway, wasn't calling someone from the bathroom pretending to check his email. The quiet wrapped around me like a blanket. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight filtering through the curtains and the faint chirp of a bird outside the window. I padded downstairs barefoot, the cold tile grounding me as I brewed a pot of coffee. There was no note from Taylor, no text message, no flowers sent in apology, just silence. And I preferred it that way. Later that afternoon, Faith called me from her apartment. "I'm sorry I left so suddenly," she said, sniffling. "You had every right to," I said, keeping my voice steady. "What he did wasn't just a betrayal of me, it was a betrayal of both of you." Faith didn't say anything for a moment, and I could hear her breathing on the other end. "I hate him," she said finally, her voice cracking. "And I know I shouldn't, but I do." "You're allowed to feel whatever you feel," I said gently. "Just don't let it stay in you too long. That kind of poison ruins everything it touches." "You sound okay," she said, almost surprised. "I will be," I replied honestly. "I don't know exactly how or when, but I will be." Faith exhaled into the phone, and it sounded like she'd been holding that breath since dinner. "Can I come over this weekend?" she asked, her voice softer now. "I don't want to be alone." "Of course," I said. "The door's always open." That evening, I stood by the window, sipping chamomile tea as twilight fell across the yard. Taylor's car didn't pull into the driveway. The house remained still, peaceful. I wondered where he was, if Holly had taken him in, if he was already playing dad to her 3 kids like mine had never existed. But then I let the thought go, like a balloon I didn't want to hold on to anymore. The weekend came with heavy rain, the kind that softened everything and made the whole house smell like damp leaves and cinnamon. Faith arrived late Friday evening, with her duffel bag slung over one shoulder and tired eyes behind smudged mascara. I met her at the door with a long hug, one she melted into without a word. "I brought brownies," she mumbled, lifting a foil-covered tray. "They're not as good as yours, but I tried." We spent the evening curled up on the couch with hot cocoa and a movie we didn't really watch. Faith kept glancing at her phone like she was waiting for a message that would never come. When I asked if she'd heard from her father, she shook her head slowly. "He texted once," she said. I didn't respond. Saturday morning the sun returned, and with it came the lightness we'd both needed. We made pancakes together, laughing when the first one came out shaped like Australia. Faith sat at the kitchen island afterward, chin in hand, watching the coffee drip. "It's weird," she said. "The house feels different without him, but not worse." I looked around at the space we'd shared for over 2 decades, trying to see it the way she did now. "Sometimes subtraction is the only way to make room for peace," I said. Faith nodded slowly, as though the words needed to settle before she could fully accept them. "Do you think he regrets it?" she asked, voice low. "What he did, leaving?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "I think he regrets the fallout," I said. "The way you and Hunter reacted, the envelope, the reality of consequences. But do I think he regrets choosing her? No, not yet anyway." Faith exhaled, tapping her fingernails against the mug in front of her. We spent the afternoon reorganizing the attic, something I'd avoided for years because of the emotional landmines hidden in every box. Taylor's high school yearbooks, the quilt his mother made us for our wedding, the pair of baby shoes we never gave to the third child we never had. Faith found a stack of holiday cards with her father's scribbled signatures and held them like artifacts from a different world. "You really loved him, didn't you?" she asked. "With everything you had." "I did," I said, carefully folding a blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar. "And that's why it hurt the way it did. Love makes you soft, even when you think you're made of steel." Faith didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told me she understood more than she ever had before. That evening, as we were lighting the fire, Hunter called. His voice was sharp and quiet, like it had been wrapped in sandpaper. "I heard from Dad," he said. "He asked to meet for lunch on Monday." I looked at Faith, who was already watching me. "And are you going?" I asked. Hunter paused before answering. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Part of me wants to scream at him in public. The other part wants to know why he thought any of this was worth it." "You're allowed to ask," I said. "But you don't owe him peace just because he's asking now." "I know," Hunter sighed. "It just still hurts, and I hate that it does." "That means you're human," I said gently. "Not weak, not broken, just human." He was quiet for a while before saying, "I'll think about it," and hanging up. Later, Faith and I sat by the fireplace wrapped in thick blankets as embers cracked and popped behind the grate. She leaned her head on my shoulder like she used to when she was little, before heartbreak and finals and boyfriends who didn't call. "I'm scared," she said quietly, "that I'll fall in love one day and he'll do to me what Dad did to you." I wrapped my arm around her tighter. "Then you'll survive it," I said, "but I hope you never have to." On Sunday morning, Faith made eggs while I folded laundry in the sunroom. The house felt normal again. Not perfect, but ours. She left just after lunch, hugging me tightly and whispering, "I'm proud of you." I smiled, blinking back the tears that always came when she said things like that. "Drive safe," I said, watching her back out of the driveway, with the sun warming the silver hood of her car. That night, alone again, I poured a glass of wine and walked through each room slowly, like I was blessing the space. I touched the mantel where Taylor's golf trophies used to sit, now replaced by candles and a framed photo of Hunter and Faith on the Ferris wheel at the county fair. I stood in the laundry room for a long time, staring at the dented dryer Taylor swore he'd fix, but never did. In the bedroom, I changed the sheets, flipped the mattress, and rearranged the dresser drawers. There was no one left to ask me why. The next day passed quietly until a knock came at the door around noon. When I opened it, Taylor stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes tired and unsure. "Can I come in?" he asked, voice low. "No," I said calmly, "but you can say what you need to from the porch." He hesitated, clearly not expecting that answer. "I saw Hunter this morning," he said. He listened, didn't say much, but he listened. I nodded, waiting. "He told me not to expect a relationship overnight," Taylor added, like it was something he needed me to validate. "And he's right," I said. "He gets to decide that." Taylor looked down at his shoes, then back up. "I just wanted you to know, I'm sorry. For everything. For how I handled it, for how I treated you." I watched him struggle with the weight of his words, the words that should have come months ago. "Do you want forgiveness, or do you want to feel better?" I asked plainly. He blinked, caught off guard. "Because those are two very different things," I added. "And I'm not in the business of making you feel better anymore." He nodded slowly, the message sinking in. "I don't know what I want," he admitted. I thought if I came here, then maybe you could fix it." I finished for him, but some things don't need fixing. They need leaving. Taylor's shoulders slumped under the weight of what he finally couldn't fix with charm or a signed check. "I'll go," he said after a long pause, taking a step back from the porch. "Good," I replied, folding my arms and staying in the doorway. "Next time, don't show up uninvited." He nodded, then turned and walked down the path, his figure smaller than I remembered. When the door clicked shut, I leaned against it and let out a long breath I didn't realize I was holding. There was no satisfaction, no victory song playing in my head, just quiet clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply done. And being done, truly done, felt like a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. I walked into the kitchen and poured the last of the coffee into a fresh mug. I brought the mug to the table and opened my laptop, something I hadn't done for pleasure in a long time. Bills, doctor's appointments, recipes. That had been the extent of my digital life until recently. Now, I found myself on a site I'd bookmarked months ago, back when everything was still unraveling. It was a local adult education program, and they were offering evening classes in interior design and creative writing. For the first time in years, the idea of doing something just for me felt not only possible, but necessary. That evening, I called Hunter to check in, not mentioning Taylor's visit until after we'd covered the basics. "He stopped by here, too," I said after a pause. "Wanted to talk." Hunter let out a dry laugh. Let me guess. Apologies, confusion, and a reminder that he's still a good guy at heart. "He left before I could find out what kind of guy he's pretending to be now," I replied. Hunter went quiet for a second, then said, "I don't know how you do it, Mom. Stay so calm." I smiled faintly, swirling the ice in my glass of water. Calm doesn't mean I'm not angry. It just means I'm tired of wasting energy on someone who spent months wasting mine. "Well," he said, "Faith and I are on your side, always." That weekend, I signed up for both classes, Tuesday nights for writing, Thursday nights for design. Faith texted me a stream of excited emojis when I told her, and Hunter sent me a sarcastic, "Finally, Mom finds a hobby that isn't folding towels perfectly." The first night of creative writing class, I arrived 10 minutes early, notebook in hand, heart pounding like I was about to take a final exam. The room was filled with women of all ages and a few quiet men who kept their heads down as they took their seats. Our instructor, a woman named Maureen with wild curls and reading glasses perched on her head, welcomed us with a gentle smile. We started with introductions, going around the circle sharing our names and why we'd signed up. "I'm Jordan," I said, when it was my turn. "And I think I'm finally ready to tell my story, if only to myself." Maureen nodded like she understood completely. No one pried, and I was grateful for that. By the second week, I had filled an entire notebook with observations and memories, things I hadn't let myself feel in real time. Writing them now felt like reclaiming space in my own life. I wrote about the first time Taylor had missed Hunter's school play and how I'd lied to the kids about why. I wrote about the smell of lavender from Holly's perfume lingering on Taylor's shirts. I wrote about the moment I realized I wasn't angry because of what he did. I was angry because he didn't care that it broke me. One night after class, Maureen stopped me on my way out. "Jordan," she said, touching my arm lightly, "you have something powerful in you. Don't be afraid to let it breathe." I nodded, unsure how to respond, but her words stayed with me the whole drive home. I didn't feel powerful yet, but maybe that was coming. On Thursday, I arrived early for my interior design class and found myself drawn to a man sitting alone near the window. He looked familiar in the way strangers sometimes do, weathered, but warm, like someone who's learned from life rather than run from it. He glanced up as I took the seat beside him and offered a quiet smile. "Jordan," I said, holding out my hand. "Clayton," he replied, shaking it with a firm but gentle grip. The class focused on spatial planning that night, but I couldn't help sneaking glances at Clayton's sketches. Minimalist, thoughtful, a mix of precision and warmth. During break, we chatted about old homes and favorite colors, and how neither of us could figure out the supply list the instructor had emailed. He laughed easily, not the forced kind I'd heard for years from Taylor, but the kind that came from someone comfortable in silence, too. When class ended, he walked me to my car without asking, just falling into step beside me like it was the most natural thing in the world. "See you next week?" he asked, and I said yes before the question had even landed. Over the next month, life started to shift. Subtly, like the way seasons do, not overnight, but undeniably. Faith visited more often, always bringing new stories and different kinds of wine, and Hunter called every Sunday without fail. I found myself rearranging furniture just to see what made the room feel more like me. The Christmas season arrived quietly, without Taylor's annual complaints about tangled lights and glitter everywhere. When the first snowfall dusted the backyard, I stood at the window with a mug of peppermint tea, watching it settle on the rose bushes. It was the same view I'd had for 23 years, but it felt entirely different now. My life hadn't exploded. It had unfolded, and now I was the one deciding what came next. I wrapped my sweater tighter and turned back toward the house, warm in ways that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Subscribe for what happens next. The house was especially quiet on Christmas Eve, but for once, the silence didn't ache. I lit the fireplace early, filled the air with pine and cloves, and draped a new garland along the banister, one I'd chosen without asking anyone's opinion. Faith arrived first, red scarf knotted sloppily around her neck, balancing a pie in one hand and a stack of wrapped gifts in the other. "I went overboard," she announced, setting everything down like she owned the place again. "But you deserve an overboard kind of Christmas, Mom." Hunter showed up a few hours later, suit jacket slung over his shoulder, and a six-pack of craft beer tucked under one arm. "Didn't know what wine Faith brought, so I covered my bases," he said, kissing my cheek before setting the beer in the fridge. "Also, I may or may not have borrowed your old recipe book to bake the gingerbread." He smiled sheepishly, and I saw a flicker of the boy who used to beg for raw cookie dough at midnight. We all laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt good to laugh without holding back. We watched old movies in our pajamas that night, eating takeout Chinese from paper boxes and letting the tree lights dance across the living room walls. Faith fell asleep first, her head on a pillow by the hearth, Ginger Cat curled up near her feet. Hunter stayed up a little longer, sipping from a glass of eggnog and staring into the fire. "Do you miss him?" he asked finally, not looking at me. I took a deep breath, feeling the truth rise without resistance. "I miss the version of him that I thought was real," I said, "but not the man who left this house to play father to someone else's children." Hunter nodded slowly, accepting the answer without judgment. "I think that's fair," he murmured. "Honestly, I'm not sure who he is anymore." In the morning, we opened gifts under the tree with cinnamon rolls and laughter and none of the usual tension that used to cloud Christmas mornings. Faith gave me a set of watercolor brushes and a blank sketchbook with a card that read, "For the stories you're still painting." Hunter framed a photo from our summer hike 2 years ago, the last time we'd all been together before the shift began. "We were happy then," he said as I unwrapped it. "And we can be happy again. Just a new version." After they left that afternoon, the house didn't feel empty. It felt full of something else, not sadness, not loss, but room. Room to breathe, to grow, to build something that belonged only to me. I carried the framed photo upstairs and placed it on my nightstand, next to the novel I was halfway through and a candle that smelled like rosemary and hope. Then I sat at my writing desk and opened my notebook to a fresh page. By New Year's, I had finished my first short story. Nothing groundbreaking, but wholly mine. Maureen read it and smiled over the top of her reading glasses. "It's not just the writing," she said, handing the pages back. "It's the ownership. You've reclaimed your narrative, Jordan." That night, I joined Clayton and a few other classmates for dinner at a quiet bistro downtown. It wasn't a date, at least not officially, but he wore a navy sweater that matched his eyes and opened the door for me with a sincerity I hadn't felt in years. We talked about books, the way interior design trends always come full circle, and the absurdity of New Year's resolutions we never keep. At midnight, we toasted with sparkling cider and laughed about how neither of us missed the party scenes we'd long outgrown. And when he walked me to my car, he didn't kiss me, just squeezed my hand and said, "Thanks for tonight." January brought snowstorms and more time for writing. I submitted a short essay to a local magazine, not expecting anything but the satisfaction of trying. A week later, I received an email with the subject line, "We'd like to publish your piece." I read it 3 times before it sunk in. Faith screamed when I told her, and Hunter texted back, "Knew it. You're the family's secret weapon." Taylor called the day the article was published. His number blinked on my phone while I stirred soup on the stove, and for a long moment, I let it ring. When I finally answered, my voice was neutral. "Hello?" He hesitated, then said, "I read it. Your article." "Oh," I said, stirring calmly. "Good." There was silence on the other end then. "Was it about me?" I laughed, not because it was funny, but because, of course, he'd make it about himself. "It was about me," I said, turning off the burner. "Everything isn't always about you, Taylor." He didn't respond, and I didn't give him the space to try. "I'm glad you're writing," he said after a pause. "You're good at it." I thanked him, because being polite was easier than being vindictive. "Anyway," he said, his voice quieter now, "I'm moving. Got a smaller place closer to the office." "I hope it's what you need," I replied. He didn't answer, and I let the silence stretch before ending the call. February was cold, but my world kept warming. Clayton and I started walking together on Sundays, not holding hands, not labeling anything, just sharing the quiet between us. He told me about his divorce, 15 years ago, amicable but hollow, and I told him about how I'd stayed too long in something that stopped being mutual. He listened without trying to fix it, and I didn't need to apologize for still grieving. Somehow, that became the foundation for something new. At the end of the month, Hunter came over to help me fix a broken railing on the back porch. "So," he said, handing me a hammer, "are you and Clayton?" "We're figuring it out," I said, tapping in a nail. "But he makes me feel like myself, and that's something I forgot I needed." Hunter nodded, and for a moment, we just worked in rhythm, the wood creaking beneath our hands. "I'm glad," he said finally. "You deserve someone who sees you, Mom, not someone who looks through you." I blinked back tears, grateful that both of my children had grown into people who understood love deeper than the surface. By the time March rolled in with its muddy slush and longer light, I was ready to repaint the guest room. I picked a color called Morning Tide, a soft, dusty blue that made the whole room breathe easier. Faith helped me tape the edges, playing music while we worked, laughing when we both ended up with paint in our hair. "This house feels like you again," she said, stepping back to admire our progress. "Not a museum of memories." April arrived with unexpected clarity, sunlight stretching longer across the windows, daffodils forcing their way through soil like hope reborn. I spent mornings in the garden, pruning roses and pulling weeds that had crept in when I wasn't paying attention, just like Taylor's lies. One afternoon, I found the old swing set rusted and leaning, the one Taylor always promised to replace but never did. I took it apart myself with a wrench and a playlist of angry women singing about freedom. The space it left behind was wide and open, ready for something new. Clayton brought coffee and bagels the following Saturday, setting them on the counter like he'd done it 100 times before. "You always bring blueberry," I said with a smile, biting into the one he'd handed me. "Because it's your favorite," he replied simply, as if that was reason enough. We sat on the back porch with our mugs, watching squirrels chase each other across the fence line. There was an ease to his presence, like I didn't need to host him or manage his comfort. "I don't want to rush you," he said, his voice gentle but grounded. "But I enjoy this, being with you like this." I didn't respond immediately, sipping my coffee and letting his words settle. "I enjoy it too," I said finally, watching the steam curl from my mug. "And I'm not afraid of it anymore." That part surprised me, the absence of fear. A week later, Faith called with unexpected news. "Don't freak out," she said, which of course made my stomach drop. "I met someone. It's new, but I think it's real." I smiled, letting out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I'm not freaking out," I said. "I'm just excited for you." His name was Mateo, and he was in her graduate program. Soft-spoken, funny, with a dog named Luna and a love for thrift store books. "He listens," she said one night. "Not just to what I say, but what I don't." That was how I knew it was different. I didn't ask too many questions, just reminded her to take it slow and stay open. She promised she would. Meanwhile, Hunter was thriving at his firm, finally putting boundaries in place that allowed him to breathe. "You were right," he told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "You don't have to choose between success and peace." I could hear the clicking of his pen as he spoke, a nervous habit he'd had since middle school. "And I want both," he added, almost as if he was admitting it to himself. No more burning out just to prove I can. One evening, I received a letter in the mail with Taylor's handwriting on the envelope. I nearly tossed it without opening it, but something in me paused. The letter was short, carefully worded, clearly rewritten several times before he'd committed it to paper. He said he was moving out of state, Seattle apparently, to start fresh, closer to some old college friend who'd offered him a consulting job. "I won't be around anymore," he wrote, "but I hope, someday, we can talk without pain between us." I stared at the letter for a long time before folding it neatly and placing it in the drawer with the old warranty manuals and light bulb receipts. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was closure, or close enough to it. I didn't cry, didn't call him, didn't even mention it to the kids right away. It was just another page in a chapter I'd already finished. The only part that lingered was how late it had come. In May, my second article was accepted, this time by a national blog for women starting over after divorce. The editor sent a kind note. "Your voice is clear and needed. Please keep writing." I printed it and pinned it to the corkboard in my writing room, right above a quote from Nora Ephron that read, "Above all, be the heroine of your life, not the victim." Faith bought me a small desk lamp shaped like a typewriter to celebrate. Hunter sent a bouquet with a card that said, "Still the family's secret weapon." By mid-May, I'd started a small newsletter, sending weekly reflections to a growing list of subscribers. Stories about choosing joy over revenge, reclaiming the mundane, and learning how to be alone without being lonely. The responses poured in. Hundreds of women writing back, sharing their own endings and beginnings. "I thought I was the only one," one woman wrote. "Thank you for showing me there's another side to heartbreak." I saved every message in a folder called Proof. Clayton and I still walked on Sundays, sometimes holding hands, sometimes not. "Labels aren't the thing," he said once as we sat on a bench by the lake. "But knowing we matter to each other, that's enough for me." I nodded, understanding him completely. Love after betrayal didn't need to shout. It just needed to show up. And he always did. The roses bloomed early that year, vibrant and wild, as if they'd waited too long to be seen. I cut a few and placed them in a vase on the kitchen table, where the envelope had once sat like a grenade. Now the space was filled with color, with peace, with possibility. It felt like breathing again after holding my lungs still for years. This was mine now, not borrowed, not negotiated, not balanced between someone else's expectations. I spent Mother's Day with Faith and Hunter at a small vineyard just outside town, the kind of place Taylor would have called overpriced nonsense. We sipped wine in the sun and laughed about old memories, the good ones, not the ones tainted by what came after. "You're different now," Faith said, handing me a small wrapped box. But not in a bad way, in a strong way. Inside the box was a pendant, simple, silver, engraved with one word, "Begin." I clutched it tightly, the weight small but meaningful. "Thank you," I whispered, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it without sadness attached. Hunter raised his glass. "To beginnings," he said, "and to Mom, who taught us how to rise." Summer crept in slowly, with golden mornings and late sunsets that made the days feel endless in the best way. I found myself waking earlier, drawn to the porch with a mug of tea and my journal, the air still cool before the heat took over. The garden had exploded into bloom. Lilies, hydrangeas, and the lavender bush that Taylor once threatened to dig up for attracting bees now thrived in the corner like a small rebellion. I liked the hum of it all, the bees, the breeze, the quiet that wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that spoke instead of swallowed. Clayton showed up one morning with a picnic basket and a smirk. "You haven't had a real Saturday off in months," he said, already setting the basket on the porch table. "No classes, no writing, no to-do list." I raised an eyebrow, but let him pull me toward his car anyway. We drove out to a lake 2 hours away, windows down, music low, his hand resting near mine without pressure. We didn't swim, just lay in the grass with strawberries and sandwiches, talking about nothing and everything. I told him about the time Taylor forgot our anniversary and brought home a blender wrapped in drugstore paper, mistaking usefulness for romance. He didn't laugh, just listened, then said, "You deserved more." "You still do?" I looked up at the sky, clouds drifting, thinking about how much had changed while the world kept moving anyway. Hunter called that evening with unexpected news. "I asked Sarah to marry me," he said, his voice somewhere between joy and disbelief. I clutched the phone with both hands, heart leaping. "She said yes, obviously," he added with a laugh, as if trying to catch up to his own decision. "We're thinking next fall, nothing too fancy, but something real." I cried happy tears after we hung up, not because I was sad, but because I wasn't. Faith came over the next weekend with swatches and Pinterest boards, already deep into helping her brother plan. "He's hopeless without me," she joked, spreading fabric samples across my table. "Sarah's wonderful, but she doesn't know what kind of plates pair with fig-colored napkins." I let her take over the kitchen while I poured us wine and played background music. Later that night, Faith sat on the porch swing, legs curled under her, sipping slowly. "Have you thought about marrying again?" she asked, looking into the dark yard, not at me. I took a long breath, letting the question linger. "Not really," I admitted. "I like where I am. Love doesn't have to mean contracts anymore." Faith nodded slowly, digesting my answer like a quiet truth. "I just want you to be happy," she said. "Not just busy, not just healing." I smiled softly. "I am happy, honey, even on the days when I'm not." Taylor's name came up less often, though sometimes it lingered in the background like a shadow in a hallway you've already walked through. Hunter mentioned he'd received a birthday card from him, polite, distant, signed only Dad. Faith hadn't heard from him since spring, and she didn't seem eager to change that. "He made his choices," she said once. "Now we're making ours." In July, I took a trip by myself to the coast. Just 3 days in a quiet bed and breakfast, with nothing but books, notebooks, and sunscreen. I walked barefoot on the beach in the mornings, wrote in the afternoons, and let the sound of waves fill whatever space had once ached. It wasn't an escape, it was a claiming. A reminder that solitude wasn't loneliness, it was ownership, and I had finally learned to own my life. When I returned, there was a letter waiting from the magazine that published my last piece. They wanted a monthly column, a space just for me to share my voice and my view on recovery, rediscovery, and what happens after the wreckage. "We think readers would love to grow with you," the editor wrote. I read it 3 times, then emailed back yes before I could overthink. I lit a candle that night and told myself out loud, "You did this. You." Clayton took me out to celebrate, choosing a small Italian place with flickering candles and worn wooden booths. "To beginnings," he said again, echoing Hunter's toast from Mother's Day. "And to the middle parts, too. The parts that get messy but matter." I clinked glasses with him, the wine rich and warm on my tongue. Here's to all the pages we never thought we'd write. August brought wedding showers and seating charts, Faith trying on bridesmaid dresses, and late-night texts from Hunter asking for advice on speeches and song selections. I helped where I was needed, never pushing, always present. I'd learned that parenting adults meant showing up when invited and stepping back when not. The wedding was scheduled for early November, just before the leaves finished falling. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me. Exactly 1 year after the Thanksgiving that changed everything. One evening, as we finalized the guest list, Hunter asked if I thought Taylor would come. "He probably will," I said after a pause, "but the question is whether he'll show up for the right reasons." Hunter looked down at the chart, then quietly removed 1 extra seat from the head table. "He can come," he said. but he's not sitting with us. In late August, I hosted a small dinner for Faith and Mateo, Hunter and Sarah and Clayton, whose presence felt natural now among my people. We grilled on the patio, watched the sun dip behind the trees, and played cards late into the night under string lights I'd hung myself. At one point, I looked around the table and felt a stillness I hadn't known I was seeking. It wasn't the perfection I used to chase, it was presence. Laughter, warmth, a space where no one had to prove anything. As the night wound down, Clayton helped me gather plates while the kids joked in the living room. "This," he said, setting down a stack of dishes. "This is the good part." I nodded, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Yeah," I said. And I almost missed it, waiting for someone who never saw me. September swept in with crisp mornings and a nervous energy that buzzed through every corner of my calendar. Faith started her final semester, Mateo moved into a new apartment closer to campus, and Hunter's wedding plans accelerated into full motion. My house became command central, lists pinned to the fridge, flower samples on the dining table, ribbon swatches draped across every chair. It was the kind of chaos I used to dread, but now it felt purposeful, like building something instead of surviving something. I woke up every day with more to do than hours to do it in, and I loved it. Clayton remained steady through it all, never intruding, but always offering help. He repaired a broken chair without being asked, picked up Faith from the train station when my car wouldn't start, and even gave Mateo advice on buying his first used car. He's a good one. Faith told me one night as we washed dishes side by side. "He doesn't take up space, he adds to it." I didn't reply right away, but I knew she was right. One Friday afternoon, a thick cream envelope arrived with no return address. I opened it carefully, heart already guessing its contents. An invitation. Taylor was getting remarried to Holly. The card was glossy and floral, their names printed in gold script with a date set for December. There was no personal note, just a formality, like a business memo. I stared at it for a long time, the way you stare at a bruise you didn't realize had formed. Holly had forgiven him, apparently, and decided to make official what he'd destroyed our family for. I wondered if the children were in the wedding. I wondered if the guests knew what this union was built on. Then I folded the invitation in half and dropped it into the recycling bin. I didn't mention it to Hunter or Faith for several days, not out of secrecy, but because I didn't want to derail the happiness we were building. When I finally brought it up during brunch, Faith rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. "He's unbelievable," she muttered, stabbing her eggs with theatrical precision. "It's been less than a year." Hunter, more reserved, just shook his head. He always moves faster when he's pretending everything's fine. "Are you going?" Faith asked me, her tone already loaded. "No," I said simply, buttering my toast. "There's no place for me in that performance." She nodded slowly, not pushing the conversation further. Hunter didn't say anything, but he looked relieved. By the end of the month, my newsletter had reached over 10,000 subscribers. Messages poured in weekly, and I started recognizing names in the replies. Women who checked in with each story, who saw me not as a stranger, but as a mirror. I wrote about letting go, about boundaries, about choosing joy without apology. One week I wrote a piece called "The Invitation I Didn't Accept," and the response was overwhelming. We can't heal if we keep attending the ceremonies of our own erasure. I wrote, and it struck a chord. Clayton read every piece, even the ones I was nervous to publish. "You say what people are afraid to say," he told me one night as we walked the trail behind my neighborhood. "But you say it without venom. That's rare." I smiled, looping my arm through his. "I'm not here to burn bridges anymore," I said. "I'm just making sure I don't cross the wrong ones." October arrived with its fiery trees and early darkness, and the wedding countdown picked up speed. Faith planned a weekend away with Sarah and the other bridesmaids, while Hunter double-checked contracts and RSVPs like a seasoned event planner. I helped where I could, taste tests, table arrangements, seating charts, and every time I felt stress creeping in, I reminded myself, this was joy, not burden. And joy, even busy joy, deserved room. My favorite part was watching how tender Hunter was with Sarah, how he reached for her hand when she wasn't expecting it, how she touched his shoulder mid-sentence like she just wanted to make sure he was real. One evening, I found myself sitting alone in the nearly finished wedding venue. Sarah's cousin had gotten them a discount at a charming old mill-turned-event space. The wood floors creaked, the string lights had just been installed, and it smelled faintly of pine and cake. I sat in the front row with a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, just breathing it in. This wasn't my wedding, but it felt like a victory. Not because Hunter was getting married, but because we had made it here, together, intact, after everything. Later that week, Faith asked if she could read one of my old journals. The year after the split, she specified, her voice cautious. I hesitated, but then handed her the one with the pressed leaf between its pages. She read silently on the couch for hours, and when she finished, she looked up with tears in her eyes. "I didn't know how much you held back," she whispered. "You didn't even show us half." "I didn't want to damage you with my pain," I said quietly, brushing hair from her face. "You were already grieving the version of him you thought was real. I couldn't add my weight to yours." Faith nodded slowly, then hugged me tight, her arms wrapped like a promise. "Thank you for surviving," she said. "And thank you for thriving after." By the last week of October, the trees had dropped most of their leaves, and Hunter's wedding was just days away. My dress was tailored, the gift wrapped, the toast written and rewritten until it felt just right. It wasn't about Taylor anymore. It wasn't about what he left behind or what he broke. This was about what we'd built in the ruins. On the eve of the wedding, we held a small rehearsal dinner at my house. The yard was strung with lights, tables draped in white linen, soft music playing through hidden speakers. Faith made a speech about love being earned, not inherited, and Clayton toasted to second chances and soft landings. Sarah's father cried quietly into his napkin, and Hunter looked at me with a smile that said everything words couldn't. As the evening wound down, I stood in the center of it all, warm, steady, and whole. The morning of the wedding broke cold but clear, sunlight catching in the frost like tiny shards of glass scattered across the grass. I woke early without an alarm, heart calm, breath steady, the kind of stillness that comes only after surviving something that tried to break you. I brewed coffee while the house remained quiet, pausing to take in the final bouquet of autumn leaves fluttering outside the kitchen window. It felt like the world was pausing with me, taking a breath before turning the next page. Today wasn't about loss, it was about legacy. Faith arrived around 10, her hair in rollers and energy buzzing like static. "Do not let me forget the earrings," she said, dumping 3 makeup bags onto the kitchen counter, and the emergency sewing kit, and the vows, and Sarah's shoes. "I'm a human post-it note right now," I smiled, handing her a travel mug of chai and reminding her to breathe. "You're not alone," I said gently, touching her shoulder. "You never have to carry anything alone again." By noon, the house was filled with people, makeup artists, caterers, groomsmen shuffling through to pick up boutonnieres. Hunter stopped by briefly in his undershirt, tie draped over one shoulder, and kissed my cheek with a smile that reminded me of his first-grade school pictures. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, reading me with that uncanny radar of his. I nodded, touching the side of his face. "More than okay. I'm proud of the man you've become." The ceremony was held at the old mill, its wide-beamed ceilings and massive windows glowing with afternoon light. Faith stood beside Sarah in her burgundy dress, beaming, her hand briefly squeezing her brother's arm before she stepped aside. I sat in the front row, hands folded, watching as Sarah walked down the aisle like the world had been waiting just for her. Hunter's face crumbled with awe, and I felt my own tears come, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of arriving at a moment you weren't sure you'd get to witness. There they were, my children, grown and grounded. Clayton sat beside me, his hand resting lightly against mine on the armrest. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence was its own vow of support. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, a ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room, and I felt tension leave me like a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. No drama. No ghosts. After they kissed and everyone clapped, the reception moved indoors, candles flickering and soft music swelling as glasses were raised. The speeches were warm and real, Faith made everyone cry, and Sarah's maid of honor recounted college stories that had the crowd roaring. I took the mic last, my hands steady even as my voice caught briefly in the first sentence. Marriage, I began, isn't just about choosing someone to stand beside you. It's about standing with yourself first, knowing who you are before you try to share that with someone else. I saw Hunter's eyes soften and Sarah's hand tighten around his. Watching you two grow together has reminded me of the beauty in rebuilding, I continued. Not from brokenness, but from clarity, from choice, from love that isn't borrowed or demanded, but freely given. I raised my glass, my voice firm now. To Hunter and Sarah, may your love be loud in laughter and quiet in storms. As the dancing started, I stepped back from the crowd, sipping champagne and letting the moment sink in. The room shimmered with joy, and for once, I didn't feel the urge to check, manage, or fix anything. This wasn't a performance, it was a celebration. Faith twirled Mateo on the dance floor, and Hunter lifted Sarah in a playful spin that made the guests cheer. Then, just before dessert, I saw him, Taylor, standing near the entrance in a dark suit, invitation in hand, his eyes scanning the room like someone looking through a window he didn't belong behind. He hadn't sent an RSVP, and no one had said he'd show, but there he was. He caught my gaze, and I gave him a polite nod. Nothing more. He lingered near the edge of the room for a few minutes, not engaging, not moving closer. And then, as if deciding for himself what we'd all already known, he turned and left without saying a word. Clayton found me a moment later, offering a fresh glass of water. Was that him? He asked quietly. I nodded. He didn't stay. Good, Clayton said, and that was all. No judgment, no gloating. As the night wound down, I helped gather favors and jackets, loading gift bags into Sarah's parents' car while the newlyweds waved from the porch. Faith looped her arm through mine, cheek flushed and hair falling loose from its pins. This was perfect, she whispered, her voice a little hoarse from singing. And you were the anchor that kept it from floating away. I squeezed her hand, heart full. Back home, the house felt still again, but this time in a way that felt earned, not imposed. I slipped out of my dress, hung it with care, and pulled on a robe before heading out to the porch with the last of the champagne. Clayton joined me after a while, bringing a blanket, draping it over my shoulders as I stared up at the stars. You did it, he said. Not just the wedding, all of it. I turned toward him, smile, soft but sure. I didn't think I'd ever get here, I admitted. There were days I thought I was done being whole. He nodded. You weren't done. You were just beginning. Again. We sat there in silence for a while, the stars blinking quietly, the wind rustling the last of the leaves. I wasn't mourning anymore. I wasn't measuring my value by who stayed or who left. I was finally, quietly, fully myself. And that was more than enough. November settled in with its muted light and early nights, the world quieting after the wedding whirlwind. Hunter and Sarah honeymooned in the Pacific Northwest, sending postcards and photos of misty forests and cozy cafes. Faith dove into her thesis with fresh fire, Mateo bringing her coffee during late study sessions, and sometimes sleeping on the couch with her notes spread across his chest. I returned to my routines, morning walks, writing deadlines, tending to the garden that was now more earth than bloom. The calm didn't feel empty. It felt deserved. One morning, I opened my inbox to find a message from a literary agent who had been reading my columns. She said my voice felt like a lighthouse, steady and real in a world full of fog, and asked if I'd ever considered turning my essays into a book. I stared at the screen, heart thudding, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Then, I hit reply and typed, yes. I've been considering it for a while. Clayton took me out that weekend to celebrate, even though I hadn't signed anything yet. It's the yes that matters, he said, clinking his coffee cup against mine at our favorite corner cafe. Saying yes to yourself, that's the hardest part. I didn't disagree. It had taken me over 20 years to learn how to choose myself without apology. The holidays came faster than expected, and for the first time, I didn't dread the season. Faith offered to host Thanksgiving, her first time cooking the whole meal, and insisted I sit and relax while she burned the rolls and called me in a panic about gravy lumps. We laughed until we cried, and then we made a new batch together, shoulder to shoulder in her tiny kitchen. Hunter and Sarah brought sparkling cider and a pie they proudly announced was store-bought with love. The four of us sat at a wobbly table with mismatched chairs and candles that dripped wax onto a wrinkled runner, and it was perfect. At one point, Faith raised her glass and said, "To Mom, who didn't just survive, she bloomed." I shook my head, embarrassed, but Hunter added, "And who taught us what it means to rebuild with grace." Sarah smiled, her hand on his, and Mateo reached over to squeeze Faith's knee. No one said Taylor's name. He belonged to another life now. The last update I received about him came from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned, casually, that Holly had moved out. "Something about the kids needing more stability," she said, stirring her tea as if she hadn't just dropped a grenade into the conversation. I nodded politely, offering nothing in return. I didn't need the details. Whatever he was doing, wherever he was now, it wasn't my burden to carry. In December, the first snow fell during the night, blanketing the neighborhood in white silence. I woke early, pulled on boots and a long wool coat, and walked the block with my gloved hands tucked in my pockets. Lights twinkled in windows, wreaths hung on doors, and somewhere in the distance I could hear a dog barking happily in the snow. I paused at the corner where the Davidson nameplate used to stand outside our mailbox. It had been replaced long ago, and for the first time I didn't feel anything when I saw it gone. That evening, Clayton came by with 2 mugs of cocoa and a new scarf. He said, "Just look like me." We sat by the fireplace, knees touching, talking about nothing in particular. "You ever think about moving?" he asked suddenly, not as a proposal, just a curiosity. "I used to," I admitted. "But now I don't feel like I'm living in someone else's house anymore. This place is mine again." I submitted the first draft of my manuscript in January, the working title scrawled in pen across the cover page, what I handed him. My editor loved it, said it read like a quiet revolution. I wrote every chapter in 5-sentence paragraphs, just as I had taught myself to do when the pain was too big to name. Faith cried when I told her that, said it felt like poetry. Hunter promised to buy 5 copies and hand one to anyone who underestimated his mother again. February brought a new rhythm, and with it, an email from Clayton's sister inviting us to a family gathering. "They want to meet the woman who got him out of his house on a Sunday," he said with a grin. I agreed, and we drove 2 hours north to a snowy little town where they welcomed me like a long-lost cousin. They asked about my book, my garden, and my kids, but not once about Taylor. That was how I knew I was in the right place. By spring, the daffodils had returned to the edge of the yard, right where I'd planted them the year I nearly gave up. I spent mornings with my hands in the soil, unafraid of the dirt, unafraid of the work. Healing, I'd learned, wasn't linear. It looped and curved and sometimes doubled back, but it never stopped moving forward. I let myself feel joy without checking the horizon for shadows. The world no longer felt like something I had to brace against. One warm afternoon in April, Faith stood in my kitchen flipping through an early copy of the book, her thumb brushing across the embossed title. "This part," she said, pointing to a paragraph halfway through, "where you wrote that silence can be a louder answer than screaming. I felt that." I nodded, remembering that moment clearly, the Thanksgiving dinner, the envelope, the way Taylor looked at me like he hadn't realized I was still capable of choice. "It took everything in me not to scream," I told her. "But sometimes silence is the most honest noise we have." On the anniversary of that dinner, I lit a candle at the center of the table, not for mourning, but for memory. The house smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary, not turkey, but still home. Hunter brought dessert, Faith brought a new board game, and Clayton brought a bottle of wine with a handwritten label, "To What Comes Next." We ate, laughed, played, and when the candle burned low, we all sat in its flickering glow, quiet but not silent. There was nothing left to prove, only everything left to live. As the evening wound down, Clayton reached for my hand beneath the table. "Do you ever wonder how it all might have gone differently?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not anymore," I said, "because the woman who would have chosen that path isn't me anymore." And that was the truth of it. I had walked through fire and come out, not just standing, but stronger. I had loved and lost and risen from the ash with my voice, my children, and my future intact. My home was not what he gave me, it was what I reclaimed. The envelope I handed him had ended one chapter, but everything that followed, that was mine. Thank you for listening to Jordan's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.